Hello, everyone. Welcome to week one, chapter one. All right, so there's actually two videos for this week. There's one that corresponds to the text readings, and then one that corresponds to the Falcone and the Eliason articles, and they're designated in Blackboard. You'll be able to tell the difference. Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of an introduction to conservation law enforcement, and mainly like why is it important? Why do we need to study it? Why do people need to know about it? Well, one reason is conservation law enforcement officers, as many of you have used that journal article or journal assignment right off the top, kind of telling me what you know about it. A lot of people really don't know anything about conservation law enforcement officers, what they do, really anything about them. So they're really one of the least well known and least understood member of the law enforcement community. Part of this to do with there's a wide variety of types of conservation law enforcement officers, a wide variety of different names that they go by. There's a lot of reasons why, but they really are one of the least well known members of the law enforcement community. They've been around forever. They've been around long, since the 1800s. In some cases. So roughly there's about 6,000 or so conservation officers in the United States right now, and that is a combination of state level and federal. Now those are the two main levels where there's officers. There are some local type park ranger / conservation law enforcement officers, but conservation law enforcement is mainly at the state and federal government. So, like a lot of police officers originally, conservation law enforcement officers were political appointees. They knew somebody who was part of one of these new kind of conservation agencies, so they had, were given this, political job, and really, a lot of times they were just used to harass political, political enemies of, other people. But then, over time, these agencies matured into more of these science-based management agencies like what we have now. And, obviously conservation officers had to mature with them. So, they quit hiring political appointees. They raised hiring standards, started having, exams, that sort of thing. Just like regular policing, like it evolved, over time. And we'll talk about kind of those standards and some of that stuff down the road, chapter 3. Originally, as they evolved too, like originally they were just part of fish and game enforcement, but over time they've had to take on more and more kind of responsibilities. They address more kind of traditional types of crimes now than they used to. Have a much more kind of broad role with public relations, educational programming. So the career or the job of the conservation law enforcement officer has really evolved over a period of time. So now you're saying, well, that's all great, but like, why do we even have them? Well, mainly because of the illegal wildlife trade. So back turn of the century, you talk about the fur trade, and animals were hunted to almost to extinction, some to extinction. The beaver was almost trapped out in America. So wildlife trade has always been kind of a problem. And currently there's a threat from wildlife crime, not only to the natural resources, but to the communities and citizens that live where these resources are located. So wildlife crimes can encompass a wide variety of things. They kind of use wildlife crimes as kind of this broad category. Some call it natural resources crime. What you're talking about, stuff related to animals, stuff related to plants, stuff related to trees, stuff pollution. Like there's a whole wide kind of range of things, public health concerns that are associated with this illegal wildlife trade. So there's ecological, there's economic, there's human costs, public health costs, national security concerns related to illegal wildlife trade. So you're talking about like just unregulated harvesting. You can get all kinds of scientific problems like imbalanced sex ratios, And those things impact long-term health of the species. If it's a keystone species, that could have this disproportionate impact on the surrounding ecosystem because the keystone species is one that's important that everything kind of keys off of. You can also get into some invasive species. Release of invasive species can have a huge ecological impact, and that's due to the illegal wildlife trade. Exotic animals, exotic plants. Sometimes they're unintentional, but things like the exotic pet trade, they've been identified as a key factor, in the introduction of exotic species. Like right now in Florida, there's a huge Burmese python problem in the Everglades. Well, how'd those things get there? Well, most of it's from the pet trade, right? People got them. They didn't want them anymore. They started turning them loose. Those things are huge. There's very few real predators for them, and they're just kind of taking over. Zebra mussels cause millions of dollars of damage every year to boats, power plants, intake valves. So invasive species are really an important problem. So economic costs, aside from ecological, I talked about the zebra mussels, right? That costs lots of money. These illegal wildlife markets can impact local communities. If they're illegal, they're removing some of the economic opportunity related to the employment, people earning income. You start removing these things from these local communities. It may increase the cost of living. Like there's all these things that are tied directly to the illegal wildlife trade. And then human costs. One relates directly to conservation officers, right? The work can be dangerous. Conservation officers work in isolated areas. They don't have readily available backup. Most people that they deal with are armed in some way, whether that's with a firearm, with a knife, something like that. Things like the weather can be dangerous to conservation officers. So there's some human cost there. In other countries, there's much higher human costs. You talk about rangers in Africa, that are killed by poachers. Thailand, Asia, there's officers, rangers that are killed. But there's also human exploitation, as a human cost of wildlife crime. They found victims of human trafficking been found on deep sea fishing vessels. So they have these people on there working these vessels and they're isolated from the rest of the world, right? They're involved in these illegal activities. So it's a very perilous situation. Like, who are they supposed to talk to? How are they supposed to get help? Unregulated fishing has also been linked to piracy in Somalia, right? So there's all kinds of these human costs that are associated with the illegal wildlife trade. Public health concerns is another issue with the wildlife trade, and one that we just recently got done with, still dealing with. COVID-19. Where did they say that could have come from? One of these wet markets, right? It could have been an illegal wildlife market. It came from animals to people. Stuff like SARS, avian influenza, Ebola. All those things are things that can be transmitted to humans through the illegal wildlife trade. And finally, national security. Now, a lot of times you don't think about wildlife crime and national security like that. I don't see how that makes how that's related or how that makes sense. Well, there's lots of money in the illegal wildlife trade. It's the second largest illegal trade behind drugs in the world. So there's lots of money in it. Well, if you're a transnational criminal group, if you're a transnational terror group, what's a good way to earn money? Illegal wildlife trade. So organized crime groups are heavily involved in it. There has been some evidence that some terror groups have gotten involved in the illegal wildlife trade. The routes that are used to smuggle illegal drugs are also used to smuggle wildlife. They use shipments of wildlife to conceal shipments of drugs. So all this is all really kind of interrelated to conservation law enforcement. All right, so who is in charge of this? Okay, so state and federal are the main agencies that are responsible. So at the state level, you're talking about agencies like, Missouri, the Missouri Department of Conservation would be the main one. There's also Missouri Department of Natural Resources that handles some other aspects of some of this. In a lot of states, it's going to be a Department of Natural Resources or a Department of Environmental Protection, something along those lines. But the federal level, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are the primary ones for monitoring and detecting illegal trade. But you also have like Customs and Border Protection, that's involved. They collaborate with the Fish and Wildlife Service. You got the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Centers for Disease Control, right? All those federal agencies all work, maybe not on the same aspects of it, but they all kind of work on this illegal wildlife trade. Then you get internationally, you have things like Interpol, right? They have an environmental security unit that has 4 enforcement teams. Fisheries, forestry, pollution, and wildlife, right? They work to address criminal networks, worldwide criminal networks, right? So you have all these kind of layers of agencies that are working, to combat wildlife crime that are composed of conservation officers. All right, so a lot of the other part of the chapter is like kind of summaries and some things like that. So I'm not going to really get into all that. So that's week 1. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. Please complete your assignments for the week, and I'll see you next week.